Okay. Good morning. This is continuing our series on the life and thought of Maimonides. And 1, 2, 3, 4. This is our fifth lecture in our initial 8-part lecture series. So we've gotten through the foundations of the Torah, and now we're moving on to the Hilchot Deot, what is translated here on page 51 as laws relating to moral dispositions and ethical conduct. Now, we have to first, I want to give you some background before we look at it as to what exactly Maimonides is doing. But again, I want you to notice his fascinating progression in the way he has set up the Mishneh Torah, which is so different from any of the other law codes. The Mishnah itself and the subsequent great law codes of the Tur in the 14th century or the Shulchan Aruch in the 16th century, which did, totally different categorizations. The Tur and the Shulchan Aruch, for example, beginning essentially with, what do you do when you get up in the morning, and moving from there. Maimonides began with ideas of belief and everything connected to the laws that he felt had to do with that belief. And so he begins with the basic ideas of God's existence. He goes on to the notion of studying the creation as a means of the fulfillment of the love and fear of God. He goes on to, of course, other topics that we looked at, like prophecy, and the last part of the Yesodei HaTorah, the foundations of the Torah, dealt with the issue of Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem, meaning the sanctification or profanation of God's name, which again are all issues of in the area of a belief in the things you understand about God and the world and your relationship to it. Having done that, which he sees as essential to the foundation of a religious life, he now moves on to the laws regarding what is called in Hebrew deot. Now, if you look at the material I've given you, you'll see that the term deot in Hebrew corresponds to an Arabic term, which I think is pronounced akhlaq. He didn't use a more common term for moral dispositions, or Joel Kramer, who did the biography of Maimonides, translates it as ethical qualities, okay, which is the way I put it. If you could just pass this down to George, please. The word midot is the word that's most commonly used for this in rabbinic literature. M-I-D-D-O-T, midot, which is the plural of midah. And the word midah is often used to refer to one of the qualities or characteristics of God. So we talk about God's midat harachamim, God's character of righteousness, as opposed to midat hadin, the character of judgment. And that sort of theme is important on the high holidays. Why didn't Maimonides use the term midot? Possibly because there's a tractate in the Mishnah which refers to the measurements of the temple, which is called midot, because the word midot, can also mean that sense of measurements as well. So he uses a term not unknown, deot, and it means it's one of these compound word meanings. It means nature, temperament, nature in the sense of a person's nature, not nature as in the natural world. Temperament, one's disposition, one's character, and one's morals. So essentially, that's what he's covering.
This was a pre-existing term.
Yes, it was a pre-existing term. But again, it's not one that is as commonly used as midot, because we, in traditionally in rabbinic texts, we are supposed to follow the midot of God, right? And you often hear in modern ethical treatises, you usually see the word midot used, not deot. But I want you to understand, because the word deot, comes from the root of things that you know, right? So it's not knowledge, all right, in the same understanding. I mean, the whole Seder, the whole major order with which this section is called the Sefer Maddah, which comes from the same root, but that means knowledge, all right, but in a broader sense. So,
also maybe from Little Mod.
no, it comes from no, that's a different root. It's Yud Daled Ayin, from Yada, meaning to know. Okay, which in the
No wine and Lil.
Limud is Lamed Mem Daled. It's a different root. That means to learn. Okay, so what is the basis of Maimonides' understanding of the deot, of the qualities, the dispositions, the temperaments that he's trying to get a person to achieve? This starts, first of all, from the basic Greek idea of the four elements: air, earth, fire, and water. Out of this comes the notion that a person can have what are called humors, right? This comes from the Greek physician Hippocrates, who lived around 460 BCE, but he didn't invent it. It probably came from earlier sources, but he's one of our more important formulators of it, and some of Hippocrates' writing was eventually translated into Arabic, and so that's how Maimonides gets it. So if you take a look at the chart on the first page of the material that I gave you, you see there are sort of down the left side, you see hot, cold, right? And then above on the top, wet, dry, okay? And in each of these, you can classify one of the four elements. So air is hot and wet. Water is cold and wet. Fire is hot and dry. Earth is cold and cold and dry. And each one of these elements within this categorization is connected to something in the body, right? What are called the humors. So blood is hot and wet. Phlegm is wet and cold. What is called yellow bile is hot and dry. And black bile is dry and cold. And the notion is that a person's health depended upon the balance of these humors. So if you got too much of one or the other, it would then cause you to be sick. All right? Hi, Sam, how are you? We're just getting into the formulation of Maimonides' understanding of the person, first of all, based on Hippocrates. So we started with the four humors. Now, out of these four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, you get temperaments. They produce temperaments in people depending upon the balance of the humors. So a person tends to have more of one kind or another, and therefore giving them different kinds of temperament. So blood produces a person who is sanguine and cheerful. Phlegm, phlegmatic and sluggish. Yellow bile, choleric and angry. And black bile, melancholy and sad. So if you are depressed, if you have depression, you have an abundance of black bile. Okay? And this he gets from Galen, who is born around 130 CE. And of course, the writings of Galen are considered to be the most important medical texts on which medieval medicine based itself. Again, this is all through Arabic translations and Arabic writers who expanded upon these ideas, but essentially these are the basis on which Maimonides understands everything. Any questions at this point about this basic ideas? Yes.
This is not so much a well, okay, what it is. I'm very troubled in reading this material as well as other material, including Aristotle, Plato, the whole gang of ancients. I'm very troubled by the fact that most of what they say is patent nonsense.
Today, yes.
Now, to understand them as people of their time, of course, is important.
Yes.
But I don't know what to do with the nonsensical conclusions that they draw.
Well, you can look at it as this is what was considered science back then, and we know science is always open-ended and that we're always learning more. But one of the things that I take from Maimonides out of all of this, which is, I think, quite compatible with modern ideas, is that the state of the body affects the state, as he would say, of the soul, or what we would say, the mind. And the state of the mind affects the state of the body. Okay, that was a well-established idea, what we would call psychosomatic effects. And in fact, there are some people who believe that a lot of the illnesses that medieval doctors had to face were in fact psychosomatic illnesses born of what we would call tension and depression. That any of the serious illnesses would have just killed people, right? In other words, the childhood diseases killed off most children under 5. Those that survived were obviously a lot stronger. Cancer would kill somebody. There was no, and by the way, cancer usually only came to people in later life, and there was no cure for it. It was recognized as a disease, and it just killed people off. Plagues, other kinds of things. Things that probably impacted people, of course, was malnutrition and starvation when there was a shortage of food. But the kinds, and of course, when you had things like broken bones and things like that, they did have ways to deal with this, but sometimes, obviously, somebody's injuries were so severe they died from it. Just a minute, Robert. But a lot of, there is a theory that a lot of the day-to-day illnesses which doctors face were, in fact, psychosomatic. And given the fact that doctors like Maimonides, essentially they did diagnostics. They didn't touch their patients. They diagnosed what they felt was the illnesses of their patients. They prescribed courses of treatment, which included diet and included other things, which some cases were auditory or olfactory, and of course certain traditional medicines, some of which must have had some efficacy. Others probably did the patient no harm at all, but because they felt that it did, would have the placebo effect. So I think what I want you to get out of this is understanding how well Maimonides understood the human psyche.
And the intertwining of the body.
Absolutely. But from these pre-modern scientific convictions. Yes. Yes, Irma.
In very brief defense of the ancients, I think considering the knowledge that was available to them, that they did some brilliant connections here.
Yes, they did. And again, as I mentioned earlier, Maimonides, there was even the notion of experimentation that was going on in the medical world that he lived in, that they would be trying certain things. And if they, although they relied on Galen almost as, holy scripture, so to speak, they also, were trying out new things and testing things and adding to the body of what worked and what didn't work, as well as learning about the body as much as they could. You have to remember, of course, dissection was completely forbidden. So the only things that they could know about the workings of the body were what they saw from the way people worked, from the examination of the body, from some traditional ideas, and probably occasionally they saw people who had mangled limbs and things like that, and they could probably learn a certain amount from that. But again, they did not do dissection in the ancient world. It was considered one of the most important taboos, which carried on for several hundred years, actually. I don't remember
I
exactly.
think it was late Middle Ages or
No, actually, in the
after that.
17th, 18th century, people began to do dissection, I believe.
Not
Correct.
even on animals?
Vesalius.
Animals, they did, and so they learned a lot from animals, obviously, but don't forget, whereas they understood there was a certain amount of connection between animals and humans, they also saw humans as there was what the philosophers call an ontological gap between humans and animals, so they would only understand that that would work a certain way, that humans in some ways were qualitatively different from animals. But it's a good point. I don't know enough about the history of medicine to know whether they made how much analogy they made with what they saw from animal bodies and things of that sort. So one other important point before we go into the text itself is that his whole approach to how do you achieve the virtuous life is taken from Aristotle's Ethics, and specifically the Nicomachean Ethics. I hope I'm pronouncing that correct. And it's by the way, it's interesting. You can read the whole thing online if you're interested in translation. And it's quite long and detailed. But here is a paragraph that kind of sums up the approach of what is often referred to as the golden mean. Okay, meaning the middle path. Cal, do you want to read it for us?
Okay. That moral virtue is a mean, then, and in what sense it is so, and that it is a mean between two vices, the one involving excess, the other deficiency, and that it is such because its character is to aim at what is intermediate in passions and in actions, has been sufficiently stated. Hence, also it is no easy task to be good, for in everything it is no easy task to find the middle. In other words, to find the middle of a circle is not for everyone, but for him who knows. So, too, anyone can get angry, that is easy, or give or spend money. But to do this to the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, with the right motive and in the right way, that is not for everyone, nor is it easy. Wherefore goodness is both rare and laudable and noble.
So Aristotle recognizes that given the state of your average human, it's not always so easy to take the middle path between, if you've got money, between being a miser and someone who is profligate, right? Between someone who is insensible to anything and someone who's always getting angry, right? Between a coward and a reckless person. But that's the goal. That's how you achieve the virtuous life, and that's how you achieve happiness. All right? And Maimonides follows this, again, through Arabic sources. He's read this stuff, and he has already written about this, by the way, in his commentary to the Mishnah, his long introduction to Pirkei Avot, the one legal tractate of the Mishnah, is something called the Shmona Prakim, the 8 chapters, because it's 8 chapters long, and became on its own a very popular treatise on the ethical life. In fact, it's most of it is included in our anthology. So he'd already written about it fairly extensively, and what he does in the Hilchot Deot, in some ways, is to summarize a lot of what he already had written in his commentary to the Mishnah. One other thing, if you look at number 5, you will see that in Hilchot Deot, again, at the beginning of each tractate, he lists the mitzvot, both positive and negative, which are going to be included in this, right? And so you'll see that these are all about ways you deal with yourself and with other people, right? I mean, to emulate God's ways, again, is to emulate God's midot, right? That's really what you're trying to do. God's characteristics, that is the pious life, to the imitatio Dei, as it's called in Latin. And you'll see the other list: to love a fellow Jew, to love converts, not to hate brethren, to know how to rebuke somebody in the proper way if you see them going morally wrong, not to embarrass people, not to oppress the unfortunate, not to gossip and not to take vengeance. These are all, things not dealing so much with physical actions, but speech and the way you are as a person. What I did was give you the entire Hilchot of chapter 5, which I thought you might be interested in seeing, because this is his way. This is where he tells you how to live properly, right? And tells you how you should eat, how you should sleep, like number 3.
How do you translate Hilchot?
Laws. Okay? So, in other words, you're supposed to you're supposed to eat 8 hours towards the end of the night. He tells you shouldn't sleep face down or on your back, but on your side, starting on your left side at the beginning of the night and right side at the end of the night. Should wait 3 or 4 hours after eating and not sleep during the day, right? I mean, some of these things are actually pretty good advice. What I find interesting, starting in Halacha 6, is his diet, right? In other words, he talks about certain kinds of laxatives because apparently one of the biggest complaints that people had was constipation, which undoubtedly, again, had to do with diet and possibly stress. And so, therefore, to be constipated is something that he felt caused a tremendous amount of difficulty. It caused a lot of people pain and all kinds of things. And talking about meat and poultry, and then starting in number 9, he talks about stuff that is extremely harmful and one should never eat them.
It's true, if you have a lentil, you're finished.
Well, he says large fish that are aged and salted, cheeses, which is truffles, mushrooms. He goes through these things, and of course, why does he say these things about certain things? Possibly because he saw people eat too much of this stuff and get sick. But some of this, of course, is based upon what you might call correspondences, that certain kinds of food correspond to certain of the elements, and therefore if you eat it, it'll throw you out of balance. Notice he suggests you shouldn't eat radishes, probably because he doesn't like the idea of people eating things that are too spicy and sharp, and most radishes today are far less sharp than probably radishes were back then. Today they're bred actually to be a lot milder.
Unless they're horseradish, that is.
Well, yeah, exactly. But the point is, he's telling you shouldn't really eat them much. He says then there are ones in number 10 which are harmful, but you can eat only some of them. And, notice he says in number 12, honey and wine are harmful to the young and wholesome for the old. And number 13 is about bowel movements. He talks about exercise.
12 is a very good example of an empirical observation which has been borne out.
Yes, because certain young people have allergies.
No.
What, honey?
Honey contains Clostridium botulinum.
Right.
And the immature gut
Can't handle it.
And to
Exactly.
this day, pediatricians will
absolutely.
do not give it.
Absolutely.
So this is a very good example of what Irma was alluding to.
Absolutely.
How often they got it right.
Right, and number 16 is about bathing, right? And 17. Number 18 is interesting because, of course, one of the common things that people did to sort of bring the body back to a balance in the humors and to make sure that some of the humors was bloodletting, right? And so he interestingly enough, still said that one should do it, but not constantly, right? And notice he says after the age of 50, you should not be bled at all. And again, in those days, 50 was an aged person. Okay?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Earlier, I think in Halacha 2,
Yeah.
it's about getting exercise.
Yes.
And I just wonder how the Orthodox feel about Maimonides' writings.
About this particular section,
Yes, because
I have no idea. In fact, it would be very interesting to me how many of them actually follow his diet.
I had a family once as a patient who was ultra-Orthodox.
Yes.
They used to bring their teenage boy to me who was perfectly healthy. He was lean, very thin.
Yes.
Very, very, very pale, even though his hemoglobin was normal.
Yes.
I said to him one day, I think it would be a good idea to get some exercise. And he never came back. They never brought him back.
It is a big problem. If you look at number 15, he says, whoever is idle and does not exercise or does not move his bowels when he has need or is constipated, even if he eats the proper food and takes care to follow the rules of medicine, will be full of pain all his life, and his strength will fade away. Overeating is like poison to the body. It is the main source of all illness. Okay? So, well, undoubtedly he probably saw people who were malnourished. Amongst the higher levels of society, overeating was a problem. And he probably saw obese people. And he understood how obesity could have a terrible effect. Number 19 is interesting. He talks about semen. And the reason is, of course, is that people had an idea that semen actually started in the brain and then traveled down through to the testes. And so he was of this, belief. The idea is that it affect, in other words, it has in it some basic sort of vital ideas, because after all, that's how, new people get born, because they believed that semen was literally the seed of new life. Therefore, it had some kind of vital element in it. And therefore, he talks about basically if you have too much sex, it will cause you problems. I mean, he doesn't even deal here, as far as I know, with masturbation. But the point is that while he understands the need for healthy sexual activity, Maimonides tends to be a little ascetic when it comes to sexual matters. So he sees too much sex as being unhealthy. He says, look at number 20. He says, whoever conducts himself in the ways which we have drawn up, I will guarantee he will not become ill throughout his life until he had reached advanced age and dies. He will not need a doctor. His body will remain intact and healthy throughout his life. Right? One may rely on this guarantee unless his body was impaired from birth. He was accustomed to one of the harmful habits of birth, or there should be a plague or drought in the world. Big causes of death. Plague and drought. And Maimonides, while he was in Egypt, by the way, there was a severe drought in Egypt to the point where thousands of people died at one point. And this happened sort of later in his life. And in fact, there were claims of cannibalism was occurring. Things were so bad. Notice number 22. He talks about why is he doing all this? Essentially because he's assuming that not everybody's going to live in a place where there's a good doctor. So he's giving you your basic health rules so that you won't need a doctor. But then notice in number 23, a Torah sage, because he's going to go on in part of this treatise to discuss the characteristics of a Torah sage, meaning a chacham, right, is not permitted to live in a community which does not have the following: a doctor, a surgeon, which technically is a bloodletter, right? A bathhouse, a latrine, an available source of water such as a river or a spring, a synagogue, a teacher of children, a scribe, a charity supervisor who handles the community fund, a rabbinical court empowered to impose corporal punishment and jail sentences. So he wants people, in order to be a proper chacham, Torah sage, you have to live in a well-ordered society. Yes, Robert?
I had thought that there were two fundamental things that you had to do when you established a Jewish community. One was a mikveh and the other was a cemetery.
Yes.
And I see here he has a bathhouse.
Yes.
But he doesn't have a cemetery.
Yes, I guess because maybe he just assumes that a community will establish a cemetery, but he's talking about a Torah sage's health. Okay? I just want to see for 1 second, because I hadn't checked it exactly. Again, I'm relying on a translation, which I'm not always so... he used the term Talmid Chacham. Talmid Chacham is the usual term for a learned person. Okay, so I wanted to just give that to you to show you because it's not in our anthology, Maimonides was a very clear-eyed, really, I think, keen observer of the world and of his, and again, having studied medicine, both theoretical and in a clinical situation in a hospital, he understood within the context of those worldview that I gave you of the elements, the humors, and the temperaments, and the well understood what were the causes of illness and health in people. Even if, some of his individual things we look at and say, why did he consider radishes unhealthy, that kind of thing. Again, I think it was probably because it was red. People assumed that food that was red must be unhealthy. In fact, people originally thought tomatoes were poisonous.
And the leaves are.
Well, and is interesting. Apparently, there was somewhere in New Jersey where some guy introduced, I think this was in the 18th or 19th century, introduced tomatoes, and people didn't want to eat it, and to prove that they were okay to eat, he stood on the steps of the local town hall and ate a tomato in public while everybody yelled, "Stop, don't eat it, it's dangerous." And apparently every year they reenact this. I forget which town it is. But anyway, what?
It's probably called tomato.
No, it is. I forget what town it is, but it's every year there's a story about it. Anyway, take a look. So we're going to start looking now at the beginning of this treatise on page 51. So Harvey, do you want to start reading it for us? Every human being.
Every human being is characterized by numerous moral dispositions which differ from each other and are exceedingly divergent. One man is choleric, always irascible, another sedate, never angry, or if he should become angry, is only slightly and very rarely so. One man is haughty to excess, another humble in the extreme. One is sensualist whose lusts are never sufficiently gratified. Another is so pure in soul that he does not even long for the few things that our physical nature needs. One is so greedy that all the money in the world would not satisfy him. As it is said, quote, "He who loves silver shall not be satisfied with silver." Another so curbs his desires that he is contented with very little, even with that which is insufficient, and does not bestir himself to obtain that which he really needs. One will suffer extreme hunger for the sake of saving and does not spend the smallest coin without a pang, while another deliberately and wantonly squanders all his property. In the same way, men differ in other traits. There are, for example, the hilarious and the melancholy, the stingy and the generous, the cruel and the merciful, the timid and the stout-hearted, and so forth.
So you see how the temperaments, he has mentioned the temperaments. He's talking here about extremes of moral disposition, the way people are. There are people on multiple levels, the variety of human characteristics.
He's writing this in Arabic, isn't
No, this is in Hebrew.
he? Is the language rich enough to
Yes, absolutely.
speak like this?
Absolutely. Okay. Irma, do you want to read number 2?
Between any moral disposition and its extreme opposite, there are intermediate dispositions, more or less removed from each other. Of all the various dispositions, some belong to a man from the beginning of his existence and correspond to his physical constitution.
See, there it is. In other words, you are born with certain physical constitution in which your humors are in sort of, certain ways. And
Can I follow here? Because I didn't copy that.
yeah, sure. Hang on.
I'll go.
There it is.
Great, thank you.
And so you're born in a certain way. So he understands what we would call one's character determined by genetics, or disposition, let us say, a tendency. But Maimonides was also, by the way, very big on environmental, your environment, your social environment, and how that had an impact on your character, as you will see. So he understood that certain people are born in certain tendencies, but also that you could absorb tendencies. And of course, he believed that people could change their tendencies.
Question.
Yeah.
When he says lev and nefesh, he means the same thing, a heart and a soul?
Which sentences?
Yeshu ba'alev tahor.
Yeah.
And he doesn't need any access of anything.
Right.
And then he says, one who has a soul, who has a soul.
Pure in soul.
Yesh ba'al nefesh.
Yeah.
I guess he's using it as a synonym.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Okay.
All right, so read on.
Others are such that a particular individual's nature is favorably predisposed to them and prone to acquire them more rapidly than other traits. Others, again, are not innate, but have been either learned from others or are self-originated as the result of an idea that has entered the mind, or because, having heard that a disposition is good for him and should be cultivated by him, one trained himself in it till it became part of his nature.
And that's Maimonides' big belief in the necessity for the right opinions. He is a great proponent of what you might call the educational theory of human character and change, right? That if you get the right knowledge and the right opinions, it will lead to the change in your character. Although he understood this is not an easy thing to do, right? He understood that people can get in a rut, and it's hard to get out of that rut, right? But he's saying you can be born with certain dispositions, but also you can acquire certain dispositions, either by something you've heard from somebody else who says if you act in this way, it'll be better for you, or things that the person has trained themselves to do. All right? George, you want to read number 3?
To cultivate either extreme in any class of dispositions is not the right course, nor is it proper for any person to follow or learn it. If a man finds that
We're at the top of page 52, number 3.
If a man finds that his nature tends or is disposed to one of these extremes, or if one has acquired and become habituated to it, he should turn back and improve so as to walk in the way of good people, which is the right way.
In other words, the middle path, right? It is wrong to go to any of the extremes which he mentioned. It's unhealthy and will cause you to do bad things to yourself and to others.
He's talking of the individual. He's not talking of society generally.
No, he's talking about the individual. He's speaking to the individual right here.
So he has no reference to societal extremes.
No, because he believes that if the right people are trained in the right way, it will lead to the good society. But as I mentioned before, and you will see it, I'll mention, probably bring this up again, in the Guide for the Perplexed, when you look at his interpretations of the reason for the commandments, for the mitzvot, they are basically of twofold: to develop the individual and to create a just and stable society, right? So that's for him the whole reason for the laws of the Torah. So he's begun with the individual, right? But as he goes on, of course, certain laws don't just apply to the individual, certain laws apply to the society. But here, he's beginning with the individual. Yes, Risa?
Is it just an accident of language, or does he intend this advice to apply only to men?
He is only speaking to men at this point, all right? His assumption is that he is speaking to men because, as I mentioned before, men are the normative category. He, as many people in the Middle Ages, believed that women did not have the same mental capacity as men. And unfortunately, you still see that today sometimes in some of the sciences. So he's really speaking to men. But of course, and he also, again, he in his practice, he saw women, and he would probably say the kind of diet advice applied to anybody. and undoubtedly this kind of advice would apply to men as well, and that's the thing you have to women as well. All right, George, why don't you keep reading? Number 4.
The right way is the mean in each group of dispositions common to humanity, namely that disposition which is equally distant from the two extremes in its class, not being nearer to the one than to the other. Hence our ancient sages exhorted us that a person should always evaluate his dispositions, and so adjust them, that they shall be at the mean between the extremes, and this will secure his physical health.
Notice that. The mean will help to secure your physical health. Go on.
I also note that this is interpretive of the ancient sages.
Yes.
So it's not like this is original material, it's like a translation or a
Compilation, absolutely. And ancient sages, he's talking here primarily to what we would call biblical texts, rabbinic texts, but Maimonides is also bringing in, the ancient Greek sages as well in this, right? Hippocrates, Galen, Aristotle.
I just wonder, is he bringing this in as justification for what he's writing, as like the proof that this is correct, is that you can find it in these places?
Yeah.
Or does he really believe it derives from them?
He is a medieval person, and medieval people, thinkers, had to, and felt that what they were doing was interpreting, compiling all ancient wisdom. That it wasn't de novo with them, right? But we know that people both collected, interpreted, and innovated, but as happens today, often people who innovate want to claim that what they are doing is authentically Jewish, right? Rather than saying, oh, this is a new thing, and the old thing is wrong and the new thing is right.
That's right.
Exactly, because that gives it authenticity and authority. Right? Yes, Robert.
I'd like to ask the Chazan, who's got it there, what is the word that he uses for mean, and how would you translate it?
I'm a little lost.
We're number 4, Halacha 4 in chapter
I
1.
was just trying to find where we are in Mishneh Torah, because this book confused me, because there's different books here, right?
No, come here, give it to me. I'll find it for you. Yeah,
This is the beginning of Mishneh Torah?
yeah.
So this is a different book here?
This is a different book.
Oh, okay. It's like,
Hilchot Deot. Number 4. Haderech hayishara hi midah benonit. The middle path, the middle
So
midah, the middle characteristic. Okay?
So the center, the middle.
The center, yes, exactly.
Because
The mean.
is a very modern.
No. It's that's in Greek. I mean,
it's
it's
in between, if you want to.
it comes from Aristotle. It comes right out of Aristotle. He's translating probably some Arabic version of the Greek, the mean. Okay.
Mean took on new meaning later in its life.
What do you mean?
Well, yeah, exactly. Or don't be so mean. Think about it.
Well, the arithmetic.
Yeah, right. That's true. All right, read on.
Thus a man, is that where we are?
Yep.
Thus a man should not be choleric, easily moved to anger, nor be like the dead without feeling, but should aim at the happy medium, be angry only for a grave cause, that rightly cause for indignation, so that the like shall not be done again.
Again, he never says you should never be angry, right? Because from the Jewish tradition, that's impossible to claim. That anger can cause all kinds of terrible things, like the anger of Moses, for example, is given as things that sort of got him in trouble. But the fact is that there are times when it is right to have righteous anger, but you shouldn't be angry all the time. Read on.
He will only desire that which the body absolutely needs and cannot do without. As it is said, the righteous eats to satisfy himself.
So, you will not overeat, right? You will not allow your your desire for food to become your central disposition.
And thus you stop eating when you're 3/4 full or whatever it was.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a good idea.
It is a good idea.
For those who don't know. He will only labor at his occupation to obtain what is necessary for his sustenance. As it is said, a little that a righteous man has is better than the riches of many wicked.
In other words, you will not work yourself to the bone in order to make money you don't need.
Someone else better take over.
Go on.
He will not be tight-fisted, nor yet a spendthrift, but will bestow charity according to his means and give a suitable loan to whoever needs it. He will be neither frivolous and given to jesting, nor mournful and melancholy, but will rejoice all his days tranquilly and cheerfully.
Maimonides was probably not a big fan of humor in the modern
He's
sense.
not going to work so much in Maimonides. Elsewhere we see he worked like crazy, right?
Because
That letter
he needed it to make a living. All right, he was supporting his brother's family. Don't forget. Go on.
And so will he comport himself with regard to all his other dispositions. This is the way of the wise. Whoever observes in his dispositions the mean is termed wise.
This is Aristotle. This is the golden mean right out of Aristotle. This was an accepted idea in the Middle Ages by Jews, Christians, and Muslims, that the virtuous life, the happy life, meant trying to live in the mean. Okay? Yes, Risa?
I keep thinking of a wonderful little vignette in the book Lost Horizon,
Uh-huh.
where a group of Western people have a plane crash in the Himalayas,
I know the story.
and they make their way, and so they come to a lamasery, where there is a whole group of lamas living what they consider to be the good life.
Right.
And the keystone of that whole thing, he is told, the Westerner is told by the Dalai Lama, is moderation.
Absolutely.
However, the Westerner observes that the Dalai Lama spends his whole day playing Mozart on the harpsichord. So he said, well, what about you, sir? You spend all your life playing Mozart. And he said, well, we believe in moderation, including about moderation.
But you see, in my
We're moderate about everything, including moderation.
right. In other words, there are times, and by the way, you will see where Maimonides actually says that sometimes you need to go a little to the one side or to the other to help correct certain things, right? And you know, there's a certain kind of stoicism involved in all of this, about the way you live your life. Okay, Robert, you want to read number 5?
Whoever is particularly scrupulous and deviates somewhat from the exact mean and disposition in one direction or the other is called a chassid.
A saint. All right. In other words, that's the way we can translate the medieval use of the term chassid, is the word saint. In other words, a saintly person who manages to live this way and is particularly scrupulous about it, because like Aristotle, he understood that most people are going to have a heck of a time actually being able to live this way all the time. Go on.
He says this person, this saint, does deviate somewhat.
Yes.
I would think the saint would not deviate.
Well, there are times when you need to deviate in a few things. Okay?
Feet of clay.
Righteous indignation.
Feet of clay.
Right. Go on. For example,
If one avoids haughtiness to the utmost extent and is exceedingly humble, he is termed a chassid, and this is the standard of saintliness. If one only departs from haughtiness as far as the mean and is humble, he is called wise, and this is the standard of wisdom, and so with all other dispositions. The ancient chassids trained their disposition away from the exact mean towards the extremes, in regard to one disposition in one direction, in regard to another in the opposite direction. This is the supererogation. We are bidden to walk in the middle path of the right and the proper ways, as it is said, and you shall walk in his way.
in other words, Maimonides recognized there are certain people who are particularly pious who are going to go to certain extremes of certain dispositions, such as humility, right? Humility is his most important one, right? Your average person is not going to do that. And so if you're able to stay in the middle, you are wise. But in certain dispositions like humility, if you go to the extreme, then you're becoming part of a very small group of people who become a Hasid, and again, you cannot use that term in terms of the modern Hasidim. It has nothing to do with it. All right?
Saint doesn't imply
Even moderation, moderation in humility.
Well, but no, here, some traits, certain people are going to go to the extreme, and that will make them saints.
I've heard the expression said to someone, "Don't be so humble. You're not that good."
Yeah.
Well, we're not talking about false humility here. Okay? All right. Risa, you want to start number 6?
Sure. In explanation of the text just quoted, the sages taught, even as God is called gracious, so be you gracious. Even as he is called merciful, so be you merciful. Even as God is called holy, so be you holy.
This is the imitatio Dei, the imitation of God's attributes, which is what the rabbis interpreted that text in Deuteronomy. Okay? And there's a number of texts in the Talmud about how do you follow the ways of God. And it comes to these notions that if God has certain characteristics, you are supposed to try and emulate them. And by the way, you see that actually expressed in the book of Leviticus in terms of holiness, and in the book of Deuteronomy in terms of things like righteousness. So it's a very old idea that you try to emulate God. You try to become God-like in the way you act in the world. And again, I'll mention a teaching I may have mentioned before of my teacher in ethics, Rabbi Seymour Siegel, may his memory be blessed, that true piety is the imitation of God. The problem is when we try to impersonate God. And there's an important distinction between them. Yes, Reese, you had a comment.
Well, I was thinking that as they are reported to us, the actions of God are hardly moderate.
Well, again, the rabbis are, of course, picking out those things that they consider the most important. Justice, righteousness, goodness, holiness, okay?
Well,
You're going to pick out the stuff in the Bible you don't think where God actually acts that way. They're not going to see it that way.
No, I think God does act that way, but it's not the golden mean.
Yeah, well, because
Abraham
right.
had to argue with
Well,
him.
yeah, I know. God is, look, the character of God as God actually appears in the Bible is very different from the way not very different, but the rabbis they're looking at it through their lens. And the rabbis, of course, in the Talmud don't talk about the golden mean. Again, we're now seeing this a third step removed. You've got the biblical perspectives of the various biblical authors. You have the rabbis' reading of that. And now you have Maimonides and other medievals' reading of that. So we're talking about layer upon layer here. Okay?
Sure.
All right, read on. Thus too,
the prophets describe the Almighty by all the various attributes, long-suffering and abounding in kindness, righteous and upright, perfect, mighty and powerful, and so forth, to teach us that these qualities are good and right, and that a human being should cultivate them, and thus imitate God as far as he can.
because nobody can be God, right? Nobody can become God.
But isn't this attributing human qualities to an unknown quantity?
Well, they're using the descriptions of God that come out in the Bible. Maimonides, on a philosophical level, which he has already talked about, understands these are all metaphorical.
Okay.
But in other words, insomuch as the prophets experienced God in human language, in human terms, that is how we are to understand it. When you read the guide, he essentially gets to he's already told you that God doesn't feel anything the way a human does, that God is highly unlike it. He's talking about the way in which the prophets perceived God. So Maimonides understood that the prophets perceived God in certain metaphorical ways that talk about certain things in what we would call positive characteristics of God, whereas Maimonides, in fact, believed that you can't actually talk about God as having a positive characteristic, but rather that what God is not. That's called the via negativa, right? Where you, in effect, say, you cannot say that God is just because that is attributing a human characteristic to God. The most you can actually say is God is not unjust, right? But he doesn't deal with that here. He's already told you a little bit about that in Mishneh Torah, about God not having human characteristics. Here he is moving to the next step where the prophets have perceived God in certain ways. And this is the way that we learn to live. Maimonides understands that on a purely philosophical level, God doesn't have human characteristics. But it's the way the prophets have perceived God that allows us to then follow those characterizations. This is like step 2, right? All right. Ed, you want to read the next one? How shall a man?
How shall a man train himself in these dispositions so that they become ingrained? Let him practice again and again the actions prompted by those dispositions, which are the mean between the extremes, and repeat them continually till they become easy and are no longer irksome to him. And so the corresponding dispositions will become a fixed part of his character.
All right, stop there. So notice his way you do it. You learn what what these dispositions are. Then you have to practice. Right? In other words, it's not something that comes easily. It requires work. You are retraining yourself mentally and through physical action to change who you are. Right? It's not an easy thing to do. In other words, just because he says this is the way you do it, he says it's practice. Repeat them constantly. Maimonides understood that change is difficult, not impossible. I mean, he believed, for example, it was very hard to pray in the right way. He says in the guide at one point that the recitation of the Shema is one of the most, in the right way, is one of the most difficult things one's could take years to learn how to do it correctly.
Could you say more?
Well, because you're supposed to do it in the right mental disposition.
Oh, it's the inner.
Yeah, it's not the words. The words are simple. It's the inner, what we call the kavanah, the inner understanding of it, and the proper way to do it according to him. In other words, we always talk in Judaism how you just have to do this. You have to do the action, and that the intention is not really what's important. Like, you're supposed to give tzedakah, and you should be, do it in a good way, but if you don't, you still do it. But the fact is, the saying of the Shema is you do not fulfill the obligation to say the Shema unless you do it in the right way. And I'm not talking about the words. And so Maimonides understood that it takes years of practice to be able to do that. And so he's talking about the same thing here. Read on, Ed.
And as the Creator is called by these attributes, which constitute the middle path in which we are to walk, this path is called the way of God. And this is what the patriarch Abraham taught his children, as it is said, "For I love him, because he will charge his children and his household after him, that they may keep the way of the Lord." Whoever walks in this way secures for himself happiness and blessing, as the text continues, in order that the Lord might bring upon Abraham that which he spoke concerning.
And this is typical for Maimonides. He tells you something and then he's going to give you biblical and rabbinic text to back up what he's talking about. Again, he doesn't quote his rabbinic sources very often directly, but he quotes a lot of biblical sources. Okay? He only alludes to the rabbinic sources, but he doesn't say Rabbi so-and-so said this and Rabbi so-and-so said that, but he always quotes, he does a lot of biblical quotation, and very often you will see he will state some idea and then he will give you the biblical text to back it up. And notice his use of the term path and way. Okay? This is a very old idea, right? The right way. In Hebrew, the derech yishara. right? The right path, the straight path. This is a very ancient notion of many people that the way you are supposed to live, it's a physical thing of the way you're supposed to walk. I mean, the word dharma means the way. And in fact, this is something I just found out. He taught his introductory poem to the Guide for the Perplexed uses what he's calling what you're going to do when you read the guide is to follow what he calls the holy way. He gets a text out of Isaiah, but for him, it's a sacred progress. It's a beautiful idea that what the coming to the right philosophical understanding of God and the world is the holy way. Sounds somewhat like some of the physical things that some of other cultures have. It's a very, very common idea. Yes, Robert.
When you were doing the Talmud with you, the point that you made was they always would put the contrary point of view.
Yes.
When he does it, does he ever double guess himself?
No.
He's
No.
definitive.
No.
I'm right.
He wants to be definitive. He's writing this so people will know what to do and not have to worry about those arguments. Right? Not get caught up in the minutia of what we call pilpul, the arguments back and forth. That's not for your average person, not even for your educated person. That for him, for most people, is a waste of their time. Right? That's why he's trying to create this book that would replace the study of Talmud. And again, as I think I pointed out to you, this was not an unusual thing within Andalusian, Jewish Andalusian writers where they tried to create paraphrases of the Talmud to get to the meat of the matter rather than all of the argument. This is very in great distinction. Again, I'll call it Andalusian or Sephardic thinkers and writers as opposed to Ashkenazic ones, okay, who didn't do that. And so this is not a foreign activity to where he came out of. But he is one of the most radical exponents of it. Don't write a paraphrase of the Talmud. I'm going to write something that's going to replace the Talmud. Again, remember what he said in his introduction. If you've got the Torah or the Tanakh and you've got this, you don't need anything else. And don't forget, he was facing a time when he felt that learning had declined, people weren't studying, he's trying to make it easy for people. There were people being attracted to Sufism, and in some cases converting to Islam because of that. He had a program that he felt was necessary to save the Jewish community from dissolution. Does somebody have a question? Sam, did you put your hand up? Yeah.
Just wondering what he would say about the diminishing numbers of conservative Judaism.
I don't know. That's a question it would be impossible for him to conceive of given his time. All right, let's look at chapter 2 then. All right, Sam, it's your turn.
To those who are sick in body, the bitter tastes as if it were sweet, and the sweet as if it were bitter. Among sick folk, some long and yearn for things unfit for food, such as earth and charcoal, and have an aversion to wholesome foods like bread and meat. The perversity depending on the severity of the illness.
This is a very shrewd observation. He's now making the analogy between the sickness of the soul and the sickness of the body. And he sees himself as a physician of the soul, not just a physician of the body. And notice he points out things that sick people often mistake the sweet for the bitter. And in other words, their senses go haywire. And he says sometimes people want to eat dirt and charcoal. Do you know, I read some years ago that throughout the world, in fact, eating dirt is a common human activity.
Children do that.
Yes.
It's called pica, P-I-C-C-A.
Yes, but the fact is that dirt sometimes is part of human diets. And by the way, Some people feel that that's a healthy thing to do because it's the way you acquire certain bacteria and it helps your immune system. It's also if you don't let kids play in the dirt. Okay, my son-in-law, who's a pediatric endocrinologist, sort of often, humoristically says he advises the parents of his patients they should eat a teaspoon of dirt every day. He feels that's healthy. Not eating the dirt, but playing in the dirt, getting dirty. We're an overly clean society.
Well, they say more and more, so many of the diseases are the result of an overactive immune system.
Well, actually, underexposed, exactly.
If you look at a child as they get away from the mother's immune system, as her antibodies go away, there's a period when a child, around about 6 months, so it's 4 to 10 months, they put everything in their mouth.
Yeah, exactly.
If they could eat the sofa, they would eat the sofa.
Right.
And it's so programmed, and it is so consistent. It has to be that's how you develop.
Absolutely, and in fact, as soon as the child emerges from the womb, they are exposed to certain kinds of bacteria. And again, we are too antiseptic in our society, and it's one of the reasons for the huge rise in autoimmune diseases. There's no doubt about there's a connection between it, and the rise of allergies, by the way. This is an obvious problem. So now, having pointed out what he knows as a doctor about sick people, he's now going to talk about the sickness of the soul, having talked about the sickness of the body. Go on. Similarly,
human beings whose souls are sick and love evil dispositions hate the way that is good and are too indolent to walk therein, finding it exceedingly irksome because of their sickness. And so Isaiah says of such people, "O they that say of evil that it is good, and of good that it is evil, that turn darkness into light and light into darkness, who take bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter."
I mean, it's amazing how he finds perfect biblical verses to back up what he says. Okay, read on. And as such.
And of such it is also said, "Who forsake the paths of integrity to walk in the ways of darkness?" What is the corrective for those who are sick in soul? They should go to the wise, who are physicians of the soul, and they will heal their maladies by instructing them in the dispositions which they should acquire till they are restored to the right path. Of those who realize that their dispositions are bad, and nevertheless do not resort to the wise to be cured, Solomon says, "Wisdom and discipline fools despise."
So if you're physically sick, you go to a doctor, a physician of the body. If you are spiritually sick, morally sick, you go to a wise man, a Talmid Chacham, who is a physician of the soul. That's how Maimonides saw himself, as a physician of the body and a physician of the soul. And that's, very often you cannot do it on your own. You have to go to a Talmid Chacham who will then instruct you how to get back to where you're supposed to go by telling you to do certain things that you must practice over and over again, like a prescription for the right medicine when your body is sick. This, by the way, he didn't invent this notion of the physician of the soul. Again, it's an old idea that was known in Arabic circles as well. But it's a very important concept for him of the role of the sage in society and his role that he saw himself as. Okay? Okay, Cal, you want to pick up the next one, number 2?
What is the method of effecting their cure? If one is irascible, he is directed so to govern himself that even if he is assaulted or reviled, he should not feel affronted. And in this course he is to persevere for a long time till the choleric temperament has been eradicated. If one is arrogant, he should accustom himself to endure much contumely, sit below everyone, and wear old and ragged garments that bring the wearer into contempt, and so forth, till arrogance is eradicated from his heart, and he has regained the middle path, which is the right way. And when he has returned to this path, he should walk in it the rest of his days. On similar lines, he should treat all his dispositions. If in any of them he is at one extreme, he should move to the opposite extreme, and keep to it for a long time till he has regained the right path, which is the normal mean in every class of disposition.
So notice the cure If you're in one extreme, you need to go to the other for a while, and that will bring you back to the middle.
It's like psychological muscle memory.
Yes, exactly. That's a good analogy. Muscle memory. You know, that an athlete trains to the point where they do not have to think about what they're doing. And really good athletes, wherein they're in the middle of whatever they're doing, they don't think about what they're doing. It's like it's automatic. It's the muscle memory knows what to do. If you're a tennis player or a hockey player, anybody else. What are you saying? Cantors are like that too?
No, I said bar mitzvah kids.
Bar mitzvah kids. Okay. So, in other words, you need to go to the extreme in some cases. If you're overly arrogant, you put on rotten clothes and you become a humble person, you know, for a while. And then when you've learned what it's, you know, that extreme, you can then go back to the middle. All right? Harvey, pick up number 3, please.
3. There are some dispositions in regard to which it is forbidden merely to keep the middle path. They must be shunned to the extreme.
In other words, there are some things where it's not good to be in the middle.
Yeah, and you have to shun them to the extreme.
Yeah.
You don't do extreme.
Yeah, well, but there are some, again, he's not like, again, even Aristotle recognizes this, right? In other words, it's not everything exactly that. There are certain situations where you need to go to the extreme in order to avoid something which is really bad.
They must be shunned to the extreme. Such a disposition is pride. The right way in this regard is not to be merely meek, but to be humble-minded and lowly of spirit to the utmost. And therefore was it said of Moses that he was exceedingly meek, not merely that he was meek. Hence our sages exhorted us, be exceedingly lowly of spirit. They also said that anyone who permits his heart to swell with haughtiness has denied the essential principle of our religion, as it is said, and your heart shall be proud, and you will forget the Lord your God. Again have they said, under a ban be he who is proud, even in the smallest degree.
So, pride is one of those things that you must try to avoid at all, because pride is a very bad thing to have. Yes?
This again is the Greek. It's hubris, which is
Yeah.
the cause of all the...
Absolutely. And by the way, you know, when Maimonides talks about evil in The Guide for the Perplexed, you know, he understands that what we would call natural events are not evil. Neither is many forms of bodily illness. That's not evil. They're bad. As I always quote you, Robert. They're bad, but they're not evil. Maimonides understands evil only to dwell within interpersonal relationships and what you do to yourself. And what you do to yourself, if you do evil things to yourself, you will then become an evil person, right? So for him, this is essential to not only help the health of your soul, and therefore also the health of your body, but also to make you a good person. If you have too much pride, you will do evil things to yourself and to others.
Irma, I thought hubris, I always interpreted hubris as false pride.
No. Real.
Overweening pride.
Overweening pride and chutzpah, we might say. Read on. And now he's going to talk about anger.
Anger, too, is exceedingly bad passion, and one should avoid it to the last extreme. One should train oneself not to be angry even for something that would just justify anger. If one wishes to arouse fear in his children and household, or in the members of his community of which he is the head, and desires to exhibit anger so that they may amend their ways, he should make a show of anger before them so as to correct them. But in reality, his mind should be composed like that of a man who simulates anger and does not really feel it.
So, in other words, righteous anger, even anger that you need to rebuke somebody, should be outward, but not inward.
The ancient sages said, he who is angry, it is the same as if he worshipped idols. And they also said, one who yields to anger, if he is a sage, his wisdom departs from him. If he is a prophet, his prophetic gifts depart from him.
And in fact, that's, what people felt when Moses got angry. That's what happened to him when he struck the rock instead of speaking to it, right? That anger causes your wisdom to depart from you, and if you are a prophet, your prophecy. And of course, think about it. When people get angry, they really do forget their wisdom, right? They really forget about the right things to say and do. It often flies out of their head, and they have no idea what they're doing at a certain point when they let anger become completely overtake them.
Well, anger...
You don't think so?
I have to stand on my position as a psychologist. The more I hear of this, if we're studying this as a way of understanding this person and his writings, by all means. But if we're understanding it as a statement of what's true and well applied to us all as human beings, I have such a knot in my chest. He's grinding us all down to a medium gray midpoint.
No, a calmness.
He doesn't allow for anything extraordinary.
No, that's not true. I'm a
bad, certainly we want to avoid. But what about the extraordinarily good?
I'm telling you, he's not talking about that. I think that there is a big difference here between, for example, modern therapy says that under the right circumstances, it's good to get your anger out because otherwise it stays inside of you and makes you depressed. That depression is about suppressed anger. But notice, even if you're under therapy, you're supposed to let the anger out under a very controlled situation. Okay? Now, again, we may say that in that respect, he's wrong, that if you have you're angry about something that you're bottled up inside of you, you have to find a constructive way to get it out. Yeah. This in respect, he is medieval. He believes that suppression, elimination, the creation of a stoic disposition is the best idea. So we could disagree with him on that and say that, but again, letting out your anger against people is the wrong thing to do. You've got to learn to let it out under very controlled circumstances. Yes, Robert?
Let me quote him. Be angry only for a grave cause that rightly calls for indignation, so that the like shall not be done again.
Right. Right. Exactly.
And you die at 55 with 12 ulcers.
I don't know. This kind of approach was worked for a lot of people for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And to tell you the truth, we live in a society now where people are told it's okay to let your anger out under any circumstances. And look at the garbage that goes on many of the media and on comments in the internet. I mean, it's horrible. People have completely lost the ability to be moderate in the expression of their emotions.
Absolutely, that's a mistake.
And again, anger, I agree that anger needs to be gotten out, but under controlled circumstances, under ways in which it becomes constructive and not destructive. I don't think he's talking about suppressing creativity. I think that's not what he's talking about.
We're all headed towards the mean. Where does Einstein shine in? Where does Beethoven come? Where did the extraordinary...
He's not talking about creativity. He's not talking about creativity. He's talking about emotional and moral dispositions.
But if he confines his passions and encourages us to do the same, to confine our passions, our extraordinariness.
I think you're misreading him here. I really do. I don't think he's talking about that at all. I really don't think he's talking about that.
Just to continue that line of thinking, should Mozart, Beethoven, and Einstein be able to exercise some pride? Must they suppress their pride at what they accomplish?
I think it's the way you deal with the word pride.
Yeah, exactly.
When the Greeks were talking about pride, it wasn't just that, well, I'm good and therefore, it was this overweening hubris where you
Well,
think you're greater
haughtiness.
than the gods. It was
Right,
what
the
the Greeks
Exactly.
was to compare
Arrogance.
himself to the gods.
Exactly.
Arrogance.
That's right, it was
It's
horrible.
arrogant. He's talking here about arrogance.
It's not self-satisfaction.
It's not self-satisfaction in what you do. It's about overwhelming arrogance. You
He
know?
certainly had the sense of Einstein as a very humble god.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, I don't know Beethoven.
And Einstein, by the way, Einstein lived what we would consider a fairly ascetic lifestyle.
Except you like boats.
And women.
And he liked music, right?
And women.
And he stole his wife's ideas and never gave her credit.
Well, I don't know about that, but anyway, let's read on. Those of an irate.
Those of an irate disposition, their life is not worth living. The sages therefore charged us that anger should be avoided to such a degree that one should train oneself to be unmoved even by things that naturally would provoke anger. And this is the good way. He's looking for a really perfect person.
No, he's saying you should try to strive those, because think about how people get angry over stupid little things.
On the road.
Okay? Right, road rage. I mean, think about it. Think about how people become consumed by anger and how terrible that is for one's health and for one's mental disposition, and how many crimes are committed in the throes of unreasonable anger. That's what he's talking about here. He saw this all the time, right? Seriously, I mean, he knows this is, and he's right. This is a bad thing. He's not talking about righteous anger. He's talking about the fact that people, who are always angry about everything and every little thing upsets them. He says, this is terrible. Mm-hmm. It's bad for their health, and it's bad for other people to be around them.
In his day, he didn't have the weapons that they're now using in their anger.
Yeah, but people killed each other. People assaulted each other. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that came up,
But now it's...
it's worse, right? We have large...
No, it's not worse. You were 7 times as likely to die a violent death in medieval London as you are today. It was much safer.
Well, because they had no police force.
Much safer to be alive today than in...
Is that right? The crime rate was much higher then?
I just gave you the numbers.
Well,
I
are
mean,
they
7
accurate numbers?
times.
Yeah. Anyway, let's finish the paragraph.
The practice of the righteous is to suffer continually and not inflict it, to hear themselves reproached, not to retort, to be impelled in what they do by love. Turn the other cheek.
Yeah, well, yes, of course.
To rejoice in suffering. Of course, then, Scripture says, and they that love him are like the going forth of the sun in the sky.
Again, he is a little ascetic for our purposes, a little too stoic for what we believe. But you have to understand, this was the ideal person that grew out of Greek civilization, in which Jews, Muslims, and Christians accepted as this notion that again, he's talking about the ideal. He understands most people can't reach this, but you're not supposed to get bothered by petty things. You're not supposed to allow other people to cause you to get angry if you can, right? Again, he's giving you the ideal that people should try and reach for. All right, Irma, read the next one.
Yeah, I like this one. One should always cultivate the habit of silence and only converse on topics of wisdom or on matters of moment to one's existence.
He didn't like small talk.
Yeah.
He didn't like gossip. Then again, the Talmudic sages didn't like it either, right? The Talmudic rabbis were also a little bit ascetic for our modern context. He didn't like useless conversation, all right? Because, let's face it, people tend to do an awful lot of talking. And so those who strive towards a spiritual ideal, and this is true in so many traditions, recommend the use of silence. Go on.
Of Rav, disciple of our sainted teacher, Rav Judah the Prince, it was said that throughout his life he never indulged in idle conversation, of which most people's talk consists.
Right.
And even of our material needs, we should not speak much. In this connection, our wise men charged, he who multiplies words causes sin, ethics of the fathers. They further said, I found nothing of better service to the body than silence. So too, in discussing Torah and wisdom, a man's words should be few but full of meaning. This the sages express in their recommendation. A man should always teach his disciples tersely. But where words are many and their meaning is small, That is folly, of which it is said, for the dream comes with much discussion, and a fool's voice with an abundance of words.
Again, I think that we would not want to, but again, they are leaning towards what we would call a certain asceticism. But think about today where silence, except in meditation, is not cultivated. I mean, if you find someone who doesn't, you're in a group of people where somebody doesn't talk very much, that's not seen as a good thing, is it? It's seen as being antisocial. Whereas, but that's not true in all cultures. I mean, I understand, for example, that amongst Navajos, the notion of like constantly talking about stuff is like completely unknown to them. They're perfectly happy to be in each other's presence without jabbering away. In other words, there are different cultural norms about the way one talks and what is considered proper conversation. And again, he's getting this is found not just, this is right out of good stuff out of Pirkei Avot, that, you know, idle conversation is wrong, and that, again, don't say something if you don't know something, right? You're supposed to listen before and think before you talk. I mean, this is all pretty good advice in some ways.
Pretty strong. He who multiplies words causes sin. You know, boredom,
No, well, you think,
exasperation, but sin?
Yeah,
think of the political world today and the use of words.
exactly. The misuse of words.
I mean, that's what I think.
For them, words matter, right?
Do you know, Shai Abinon had a story, I think it was Tehillah, when he said that everybody's born with a certain number of words. And when you finish that number, you die.
So don't use them up.
No, it differs for each person.
All right. George, you want to read the next one?
Where are we? What
Number 5.
A fence to wisdom is silence. Hence a man should not be hasty in reply nor talk much. He should teach his pupils gently and calmly, not shouting and avoiding prolixity. Solomon said, the words of the wise spoken quietly are heard.
So here's a lesson to teachers. Don't shout at your students. Be respectful of them. Don't be angry with them, right? He's in his rules of the study of Torah, he talks more about this, about, you know, good teachers, you know, have to act in a certain way and not get angry or whatever. It's good advice as someone who's a long teacher, you know. I mean, it's something that's not always easy to avoid, right? But the way to get your message across is to be respectful and to listen. It doesn't mean that he said everybody's opinion should be, you know, the same, but because you need to correct people if you feel that they're wrong, whatever. But let's do one more.
It is forbidden to accustom oneself to smooth speech and flatteries. One must not say one thing and mean another. Inward and outward self should correspond. Only what we have in mind should we utter with the mouth. We must deceive no one, not even an idolater. A man, for example, must not sell to an idolater flesh from a beast that has died naturally, as if it were meat of an animal ritually slaughtered. Nor should one sell a shoe, the leather of which came from the hide of a beast that met with a natural death, allowing it to be believed that the leather came from the hide of a ritually slaughtered animal.
Stop there. He's talking about here how speech can be misused to cause deception in business, which ends up being immoral. Right?
Expand on that, please, Rabbi.
Don't do smooth speech and flatteries. You must not say one thing and mean another. Right? In other words, false advertising, he's in effect saying.
But these things about an animal that's died a natural death are really not like that. They're saying don't allow someone to be deceived by circumstances, not by speech.
No, but you're making a speech claim. Because an animal that's died of itself in the Jewish tradition, of course, is treif. And,
Right.
and as we know, it's probably not, you know, it's roadkill, you know, it's not healthy, right? The point is, somebody comes to you and wants some meat, and you say, yes, of course, it came from an animal that was properly slaughtered, and you lie to them, right?
Well, if someone comes to buy a shoe, are they really going to question how the leather came to be? It's more like you don't permit such a fraud to happen.
Well, but
That's
it's
I see.
but again, the fraud starts with the speech, right? You say one thing, but you mean another. Okay, read on.
One must not urge another to join one at a meal when one is aware that the invitation will not be accepted.
Isn't that interesting?
Come visit me sometime.
When?
Let's have lunch together, and you don't expect them to actually do it.
And then they do inevitably.
Have your people call my people.
Right, exactly. Go on.
Nor should one press upon another any marks of friendship which one knows will be declined. So too, casks of wine which must be open for sale should not be broached in such a way as to deceive a guest and make him believe that they have been opened in his honor, and so forth. Even a single word of flattery or deception is forbidden. A person should always cherish truthful speech, an upright spirit, and a pure heart free from all forwardness and perversity.
So there you go.
This sounds a little
Amen.
Pollyannish. I have to
It's an ideal. He knows that people are naturally inclined towards flattery, towards doing things like, yes, let's get together for lunch, when what you're really feeling is, I never want to see this person again. He understands that. He's trying to get people to, and again, he feels this is the foundation of a good and just and orderly society, that people should strive to act in that way. He doesn't expect everybody's going to make it, but he wants you to try to reach towards these goals. That's the true of any kind of moral treatise or disposition. You state the ideal, you try to get people to work towards that, knowing very likely that it's not so easy for most people to do it. We'll see you next week.
That's really,
Shai Abnon, the one who, I think it's